Recently, Dead by Daylight released a new skill-based matchmaking system that sparked a lot of discussion within the community. Since I've implemented a system like this in the past, I figured I was in a decent position to contribute my thoughts to the conversation. So in this video, I'm going to be going over what an MMR system is, how they work, and it should be insightful even for people who are like reasonably familiar with the topic. And then I'm going to go over some of the problems that come when we try to add one of these systems to Dead by Daylight, and then look at how Dead by Daylight's team handled these problems, and then give my own thoughts on some minor tweaks that could be made to their solution. And then finally, I'm just going to talk about a few criticisms that have come up within the community and address those. So what is an MMR system? Our objective, in short, is to create fair matches where both teams have a reasonable chance of winning. And in order to do this, we need to be able to make accurate predictions about the odds of each team winning before the match begins. So if we see a team that has a 90% chance to beat the other team, then we know that's not a fair match. And if they're closer to a 50-50, then we think that is a fair match, right? And in order to figure out who's close to 50-50, we need to know how close they are, right? So our objective is just going to be able to make the most accurate predictions possible. Ideally, we could run an infinite number of matches and play every player against every other player in the system an infinite number of times, and then we would be able to distribute them perfectly across our ratings and have a perfect rating system. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a visual example of our perfect rating system, and then after we look at what we're trying to achieve, we can talk about more feasible ways of actually getting there. So here we have our visualization of our perfect rating system, and at the bottom we have everyone's rating, and then we have a group of players at each rating who's at exactly that rating. We can also imagine that there's more, like thousands of players dispersed across the rest of the rating system, but these are just a sample of a few players who are at exactly each of these ratings. And then above it all, we have this bell curve here, and assuming we've distributed everyone across the ratings exactly how we want to, then this bell curve is how we make our predictions about who's going to win what match. So the way that this curve works is that what we're looking at right now is the curve for green. This curve is centered above green, so this is green's curve. So this means that this curve is useful for if our first player is green, we want to figure out what the chances that first player wins against another player. So let's say that the other player is also green. We would use this line in the middle here, and we're going to fill in, and we're going to find out what the area under our curve is to the right of that line. And we can see pretty clearly that it's 50%, which is exactly what we're looking for. A green player should have a 50% win rate against another green player. That should be intuitive. And what we can also do is we can say if we have our green player and we match them against an orange player, we would do the same thing. We would calculate the area under the curve to the right of this orange player, and that would come out to exactly 34%. And if we looked at thousands of matches between one green player and one orange player, we would expect to see a 34% win rate for the green player. And in fact, that's what we would see, because this is our perfect system. We would see exactly 34%. And then we do the same thing for a purple player. If we calculated this area under the curve, this would be 66%. And the same would hold true if we took a random purple and a random green 1,000 times over, the green player would win 64% of the time. And we can do one more cool thing, is if we take a random player who's not at one of these breakpoints, we could do the same thing. We could figure out, this area, and, this player, maybe they're at 1475 or something like that. We could still do the same calculation, figure out the same area, and determine the exact win rate, or the expected win rate for a green player versus that arbitrary player. So remember, these examples are all based around green as player 1. So let's just take a look at an example that doesn't include a green player. So let's say we take a pink player or an orange player as our player 1. The curve would be over here and it would look like this. And then if we played them against a black player, we would do the same thing. We'd fill in the area to the right. And this would come out to 34% for orange. So orange would have a 34% chance to beat a black, and we would also be able to do the same calculation, and we'd see that orange has a 66% chance to beat green, who we saw earlier has a 34% chance to beat them, so that maths out evenly, right? So this curve goes sort of on top of your player 1, and you can use it to figure out everyone else's win rates. So everything I just talked about works out in aggregate, at a macro level. which means that if we took a random player from green and a random player from orange, and we repeated that thousands and thousands of times, we would see something very close to our 34-66% win rate that we expect. But maybe it doesn't work on an individual level. What that means is that maybe this specific green player here, they love to bring strong med kits and botany knowledge and this really good healing build that they love, and they bring that 99% of their games. And this orange player here plays Plague, who you cannot heal against. So this specific matchup, because Plague is countering one of Green's weak strengths, if we took this exact player and this exact player and we matched them against each other thousands of times, we might see something like a 10%, 90% split. And then the same thing goes for another orange player over here who might play a lot of hit and run Wraith and who might hate healing builds. If we played them against that specific green player with a strong medkit, and we did that thousands of times, we might see like a 50-50 split, even though these guys are in different ratings. So this works in aggregate across all these different players, but it doesn't work if we take specific individuals against a specific other individual. So you can't say this specific green player has a 64% chance to beat this specific orange player, but you can say a random green player has a 34% chance to beat a random orange player. All right, so that covers all of the features that our idealized system should have. And now we're going to talk quickly about how we get there. So most of you guys are already reasonably familiar with this. We have a bunch of players playing matches against each other, and each time they play a match, their rating is going to get updated based on the results. And the way that we do that is we're going to plug in player 1's rating and maybe some other numbers that are relevant, and we're going to plug in player 2's rating, and we're going to plug in who the winner is. And then this formula is going to crunch some numbers, and then it's going to spit back out the new ratings for player 1 and player 2, right? So let's imagine we have this orange player, and they keep matching against green players, right? We expect our orange players to hover around 1600 rating, to get pretty close to here. So what we expect to see is we'll expect to see orange win a match and get some rating, and then win another match, and they'll get a little less rating than they did before because of the first important feature of the system, right? Is that when you do unexpected things, the results are, it makes a larger change on your rating, and when you do expected things, it makes a smaller change, right? So if the grand champion loses to a baby, then it's not really going to change anyone's rating much. We expected that to happen. But if the grand champion beats a baby, but if the grand champion loses to a baby, then we say, oh, this grand champion might not actually be at the right rating. So we'll make a larger change to their rating when that sort of thing happens. So if our orange player is winning consistently against green players, what we'll see is that they'll eventually make their way up to around the 1600 where they're supposed to be. And maybe they'll go win, 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 lose, win, 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 lose, and they'll keep getting pulled back to here. And look what happens. Maybe they get a lucky win streak. Win, 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 lose, win, 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 lose, win, 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 lose, win, 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 lose. And because they the higher their rating is, the more they lose when they lose. If they keep this trend up in the long term, if they keep the same win rate in the long term, they'll eventually be pulled back like a mathematical gravity well. They'll be pulled back to their correct rating based on their long-term trends. So short-term win streaks and lose streaks, they'll have an impact on their rating in the short term, but they'll match against stronger players, and eventually things will even out and they'll return to their correct rating, unless their skills actually change and then they start getting a different win rate in the long term. So short-term win streaks don't make as much of a difference here. One more really cool property is how this ties back to our bell curve. How does this tie back to being able to predict the outcomes of matches? Is that the way that orange stabilizes around 1600 is by assuming they're always matching against green, is by having a win rate that looks like this: win, 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 lose, win, 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 lose. And now we see, oh my god, look, this ties right back to our win rate probabilities, right? Where we see that this orange player has a very specific chance to beat these green players, and if they don't have that chance, they'll be pulled to the rating where they do. If they keep matching against orange players, it might look something like win, lose, 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 win, win, lose, 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 win, lose, win, lose, win, and they'll keep, again, getting pulled back as long as they have that 50% win rate against orange players back to their correct rating. So hopefully this seems to make, intuitive sense, even though we didn't dive into the math, as to how these rating systems pull players into the ratings where they're supposed to be based on their win rates against other players of other ratings. and how those win rates against other players of other ratings help us make predictions about how players will win in the future. All right, so we're going to touch on one last feature of an idealized matchmaking system, and then we're going to segue directly into problem 1 of 3 for why this is really tricky to do in Dead by Daylight. So, a lot of players imagine the population distribution to be spread across all matches, all ranks in this way, right? Where there's most players are, in the middle, most players are average, and then there's a smaller number of players who are better and better and better and above average, and there's a really small number of exceptional players, and then the same way where there's a smaller number of players who are below average, and there's a really small number of players who are just, absolutely miserable. But this isn't actually the way we see most population distributions across rating systems. For example, in a game like chess, we might see something like, a large number of beginner players, and then these guys fall off to the above average players, and then maybe like a ramp up here of players who are really interested in chess and watch tons of YouTube videos, and then their skills fall off, and then maybe we see a spike here for people who have chess tutors. And then, at the really high ranks, we might see another big spike for people who play chess competitively in tournaments and who have way more tournament experience than the average chess player. And you can't hope to get up to this level without playing a ton in tournaments, right? So we see these different narratives, these different populations of players distribute differently across the rankings. It's nowhere near even. But this usually isn't a problem for most games, right? You just match, players around a certain rank with other players around that rank, and, it just works out fine. There's players for everyone to match against. How is this a big problem in Dead by Daylight? Is that you have two different ecosystems of players. You have killer players who actually win more matches on average, which is going to offset the killer curve, right? So the killer curve might look something like this. Something like that. And the survivor curve might look something like this. Maybe we have a peak somewhere for survive with friends players. But because killers win more games on average, the killer curve is going to be offset to the right and the survivor curve is going to be offset to the left. And that's going to leave us with probably a few baby survivors at the bottom, who are, having a hard time finding matches. But that might not be as big a problem as the killers who are offset to the right, to the far tail of the distribution, who are having a really hard time finding matches. And I think this is why some people found extremely, extremely, extremely long matches the first time matchmaking was tried. And it seems like their solution to this that DBD used, which I think is reasonable, is they just put a wall up so nobody can, progress their rating beyond this wall. And all of these killers sort of just end up clumped up right here against this barrier. And I think this makes perfect sense, right? This will still ensure that these killers have enough players to, play against from this whole tail end of the survivor distribution, but that they don't get stranded in this, rating island over here, with no one to match against. The next problem we run into in Dead by Daylight is this formula. All of the rating formulas expect one winner and one loser, or maybe in a team game, a few winners and a few losers, or in a free for all, you can rank order players from 1 to 8 and, order them and distribute rating it in some way. There's lots of different modified formulas. I don't know of any formula that takes 4 different players. And plays them against one player, like a 4v1. There's just not a lot of 4v1 games. There's not a lot of research done. There's not a lot of math being done. So the fact that this formula is missing for a 4v1 game is a really big problem, because now you only have 2 options. You either make your own formula, which requires a lot of research, a lot of math, and you'll be the first one doing it, so it's really risky. But a better solution, and the one that I think is super reasonable that they went with, is just making it so that they treat each game as 4 separate 1v1s between the killer and survivor. And for the purposes of a matchmaking system, I think this is perfectly fine. In the long run, it's sort of like League of Legends, right? Like, you're only one of the 10 players participating in that game, but in the long run, your personal win rate is going to map reasonably well onto your rating. And while this does create a little bit of confusion in Dead by Daylight, I think that in the long run, this should average out and not cause any problems, assuming we choose a reasonable win condition, which is the last and definitely the biggest problem in Dead by Daylight. So the last problem and the biggest problem for Dead by Daylight is that Dead by Daylight has never had a win condition. And we're going to have to pick one for these rating systems. Every rating system assumes that some players are going to win and some players are going to lose. And what's really cool is that since we've addressed the rest of the problems, we can actually pick any win condition we want, and everything else will still work. The math will still work. It should just work out pretty well, right? So what we want to do is we want to figure out which win condition we pick and what distribution of players and ratings and win percentage that we optimize for is going to create the most fun matches. So first I'm just going to start with an absurd example, right? We could pick maximum number of medkit heals as our win condition for Dead by Daylight, and everything would just work. Players who get more medkit heals are going to go up in rating. Players who get fewer medkit heals are going to go down, and our system will very accurately predict who's getting the most medkit heals. Obviously, that isn't going to correspond to who's having the most fun games and who's having the most fair matches. It's going to weirdly optimize for survivors with weird builds, right? So that is like an example of how not to do it, right? Um, Emblem system is a reasonable proxy for skill. We're getting closer, right? Someone who gets more emblems seems like they'll probably be getting more hooks, more hits, more wins, and it seems like it's something that is going to get us closer to fair matches, right? If you're doing really poorly in your games, you'll get brutal. If you're doing really well, you'll get merciless. And we it seems like it would get us pretty close. I actually think it would be a decent system, but definitely not the best we could do, and definitely not a reasonable option given the other options available. One big problem with the emblem system is that if there's players who prefer certain playstyles, like Tombstone Mike, they're going to get disproportionately uh, faced against weaker players. Or if you have a player that's trying to do an endgame build who lets all the generators go and then focuses on using perks like No Ed and No Way Out to come back in the late game, those strategies are also going to seem like they would be penalized. And then vice versa, if you have a player like Legion who's getting lots of bleeds on people, that play style might be preferred, and that poor sweet innocent Legion is going to start going up against some of the best survivors in the game because they're getting so many emblem points. So no matter how we do our emblem system, we're always going to prefer certain playstyles over other, and we don't want to do that. We want to figure out who the best player is regardless of playstyle. So what we sort of get to is kills, and there's really two ways to do it on the survivor side. You can either do it based on solo escapes or based on team escapes. And Dead by Daylight chose to do it based on solo escapes, which I disagree with, right? Um, if you're doing high skill actions, if you're conserving pallets, if you're unhooking at the right time, if you're doing all these sorts of things, then you're more likely to have more of your teammates escape. They'll have more pallets on the map, the killer will have more of their time wasted. If you're doing selfish actions, like hiding in a corner for a really extended period of time, hiding in lockers for an extended period of time, not unhooking your teammates when you might have a chance of doing so, things like that, they're going to help individuals survive games, but those are low skill actions that'll make more of their team lose, you know, uh, in aggregate, right? And what I would compare it to is someone who's like playing for kills in other games, right? If you're in a team game and you're playing for kills, you'll get the highest position on the scoreboard. It'll be good for you technically in some sense, but you're not really helping your team win. You're not really playing the game in its entirety, right? So I just think team escapes would be a better way to go about it. The other side of things is on the killer side is, do we want to base a killer win based on kills or based on hooks? And the reason I dislike hooks is, again, for the Tombstone Mike example, there might be some builds that focus on, stalking your opponent the entire match and then, one-shot killing everyone, right? So doing it based on hooks, because it disproportionately penalizes certain playstyles, I just don't like it. But both systems, I think, would be perfectly fine, just to be super clear. And I think that solo escapes is actually, even though it's not how I would do it, I think it's going to be really, really, really close in terms of the results. I don't think the results are going to be off by an order of magnitude. I think strong survivors are going to survive more games, and I think weak survivors are going to die in more games overall. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that. All right, so just to summarize really briefly the three problems in DBD, we have the formula problem, which is solved pretty reasonably by saying that there's four different 1v1s, and that's just a mathematical issue, and I think that having four separate 1v1s is perfectly fine in terms of the math. The other problem was the two separate ecosystems for Survivor and Killer, and the fact that having these ecosystems have long tails that are really far away from the other player's ecosystem is going to create really long matchmaking at the high ends, and they solve that by putting up this rating wall, and I think that also seems super reasonable. The last concern with DBD, and the biggest one by far from every critique, is just the fact that it's really difficult to choose a win condition. But I do think the one that they chose maps reasonably well onto Survivor skill, although mapping team escapes might be a little better. And both of those solutions work out the same way for the killer. The last thing I want to touch on is I just want to talk about some community criticisms and give my feedback on why I don't think they're as big of a problem as some members of the community feel that they are. So one problem that people point out, which comes from a reasonable place, right, is that it's impossible to measure skill, right? Like, how can you measure decision making against strategy, against game knowledge and game sense and instinct and reflexes and all these other skills that go into it? And how do you weigh those skills against one another? It just seems impossible when you think about it like that, because it is, right? It doesn't make any sense. But we have to remember in these rating systems, our objective is to figure out the probability that a player will achieve some win condition, right? That a player will win. And what are we ultimately trying to do when we think about all these different variables about decision making and about palette efficiency and about gen time? When we're thinking about all those variables, we're thinking those are all proxies for escaping. They're thinking, we're thinking, how good is the survivor at doing these micro actions, which will eventually, in aggregate, accumulate to them escaping, right? And uh, what it's the way it turns out is that we don't need to measure any of these variables. Uh, we could just look at escapes, and that's it, because all these things are a proxy for whether or not you escape. Um, there's a few small arguments you can make. In Overwatch, for example, they did measure some of these systems because uh, in a team game, they help figure out, even if your team loses, they figure out who's the best player on the team, and maybe they give you a little bit of points if you were overperforming for your role. But they actually disable that at high levels in Overwatch because you're trading off mobility. You move faster through the rating system for accuracy. It's actually more accurate to track your just pure win loss ratio. Um, so there's trade-offs to be made, there's arguments to be made, but at the end of the day, the idea that not being able to track these minutia details is a breaking thing for the system is not accurate. So another criticism that we've seen is add-ons bringing in items to matches, and the way that this would play out in our rating system is that if someone brings in an iridescent item every single match, they bring in the best loadout they can. Um, their rating is going to be inflated by that. It won't reflect their true skill at the game, but it will reflect how often they win matches because they win matches more when they bring those items. And if someone is bringing in those items consistently in a large number of games, their rating should be higher because that's a prediction that they'll continue to bring those items in. Once they stop bringing those items after a few games, their rating should start to move back towards where it would be if they weren't bringing those items. So it's actually correct to adjust their rating based on those items. Someone bringing in strong items and strong perks every game should go up against stronger players. If we predict that they'll be doing that, then that's what we should do to compensate. So again, I think this is actually the system working as intended, and that this is a benefit of the system. All right. So that wraps up most of my arguments. I'm just going to go through a few little final notes. We talked about what an MMR system is, some cool properties of it, and how we achieve that in real life. We proposed a couple changes to DBD. I didn't mention this during the thing, but it's crazy that hatches count as like a null or like a tie. It would be like if you're in chess and you're behind like 10 points of material, you could just flip a coin, and if you win the coin flip, it counts as the game is just canceled. It's just ludicrous that this mechanic would be factored into the MMR system. Maybe there's an argument to be made if all the gens are done and you escape through the hatch, like okay, like maybe. But if there's still a gen up, that's like 1,000,000% should be counted as a loss for the purposes of the MMR system. The only benefit of counting it as a tie is if you want to punish baby Dwights who hide in lockers all game by forcing them to face stronger survivors by like giving them more ties instead of more losses. Like that's like a reasonable thing. But I can't imagine why anyone would make the decision. Like it just feels like they were just intuitively like, oh, hatch isn't really a loss, so let's not count it as a loss. But they're not really thinking about their objectives. But that's my only like real major criticism of Dead by Daylight's system. I think everything else they did was like fine. I think team escapes would have been better, like I've mentioned, but that's it. So that about wraps up all my thoughts on this. And the last thing that I wanted to do is just give a little shout out and thanks, to Otzdarva and Scott Jund for being, great positive pillars of the community and for participating in this discussion and inspiring me to spend a few hours putting this video together. So, yeah, I'm totally open to any follow-up conversations, definitely comments, all the YouTuber stuff, blah, 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 blah. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and maybe I'll make another video sometime. I don't know.